Good afternoon, and welcome to this special session on growth and finance, celebrating Dr. C. Rangarajan as he turns 90. Dr. Rangarajan is amongst the tallest figures in the Indian reforms history, a humble and a simple man who has made long-term contributions and brought about major transformations. His achievements are immense, both in academia as well as the government. He has been a member of the Planning Commission, Governor of Reserve Bank of India, Governor of Andhra Pradesh, Chairman, 12th Finance Commission, and Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, besides a brief stint at the Rajya Sabha. India has gained from his expertise in innumerable areas, but it is the Reserve Bank of India that gained the most from his contributions, and history will etch his name in golden letters on the walls of this august institution. We pay Dr. Rangarajan a tribute on behalf of a grateful nation. Participating today are Dr. Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister, Dr. Bibek Debroy, Chairman, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission, Mr. N.K. Singh, Chairman, 15th Finance Commission, Dr. D. Subbarao, former Governor, RBI, Dr. Dipali Joshi, Distinguished Fellow, SKOCH Development Foundation and former Executive Director, RBI, Professor Errol D'Souza, Director, IIM Ahmedabad, Mr. M. Damodaran, former Chairman, SEBI, Ms. Reema Nanavati, Executive Director, SEVA, Professor Mahendra Dev, Director and Vice Chancellor, IGIDR, Professor Abhiman Das, Chairperson, Mishra Center for Financial Markets and Economy, IIM Ahmedabad, and Dr. D.B. Phatak, Director, SKOCH Development Foundation and IITB Mumbai. Mr. Amitabh Kant and Dr. Adnan, despite their keenness to be part of the occasion, could not join due to their work. May I now invite Mr. Samir Kochar, Chairman, SKOCH Group, for his opening remarks.
Namaskar. Dr. Rangarajan is the banyan tree under whose shadow a weary economy has been nursed back to health on several occasions, and some of the biggest challenges that India has faced as a country have been resolved. It was in December 1991, when Prime Minister Chandrasekhar was there and the balance of payment crisis was imminent, that Dr. Rangarajan and the then CA, Mr. Deepak Nayyar, was sent to IMF to figure out if they would be willing to lend to India. While they were still there, the Chandrasekhar government fell, and then they were asked, which government do you represent? And Dr. Rangarajan's answer was, you don't worry about that, we will handle it, let's just go ahead. And with no government being in place, such was the stature of Dr. Rangarajan that IMF loan did materialize and came through. It is his stature that everybody who has a sense of history or a sense of gratitude to the Indian reform process and where we are today, and has been touched by his work, has agreed to be here today on this panel and speak for him. The idea originally came from Dr. Bibek Debroy, who is his successor to the chair of Chairman Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. And he said that this occasion must be marked and we must all come and speak on Dr. Rangarajan's contribution. Dr. Rangarajan has touched so many people in so many different ways. My own personal experience of him, where he's really enriched my life is in the area of financial inclusion. It has been a mission for me since almost since I, entered adulthood, since I was 18 years old, that somehow or the other we have to fight this, evil of poverty. In 2004, financial inclusion objectives were announced in the budget by Mr. Chidambaram, but as with any nascent government policy, it had a lot of inherent drawbacks and some inbuilt points of failure. So Dr. Rangarajan's committee was formed to look into that and recommend what is to be done. At the same time, we were doing our work. We had done a conference called Northeast at Work in 2006, along with RBI, where several recommendations had been returned. And it was Dr. Rangarajan who accepted all those recommendations and was kind enough to include them in his report. Having done that was not the end. There was the then Deputy Governor at RBI was Dr. Usha Thorat. I had to go meet her because RBI was still quite rigid on some areas. And I was able to persuade her to allow business correspondence for profit besides some of the other things. But the singular thing that made sure that financial inclusion does not fail and there is a massive change is corporate VCs being allowed and for-profit entities being allowed. And it is because of that that Jandan today is legendary. I edited a festival in his honor. He was conferred the SKOCH Lifetime Achievement Award in 2008. I edited a festival in his honor, and I had the privilege of having the then Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh write the foreword to it. And it is indeed a pleasure and a privilege that even today he has kindly consented to participate and share his views on Dr. Rangarajan, Dr. Manmohan Singh.
Dear Dr. Rangarajan, my esteemed friends participating in this special session on growth and finance, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. C. Rangarajan has been a very close friend and a distinguished economist. I have the privilege of knowing him for over 50 years. He is completing 90 fulfilling years that started in a small town called Ariyuvullar, now Perambulur. This journey has taken him around and at the peaks of financial and economic world globally. I have not known anyone more dependable, more impartial, and more valuable in the advice he gave us as the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council during my tenure as the Prime Minister. I remain deeply indebted for the advice that he gave to the government at that time. As Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, he exerted profound influence in the formulation of monetary policy and exchange rate policies. He is one of those rare economists who are capable of straddling the two worlds of academia and the government. Indeed, Dr. Rangarajan has excelled himself in many of the public positions he has held by tempering his economic convictions with a very sound discrimination between what is practically feasible and what is not. Right from the days when he taught at the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce, the Graduate School of Business Administration of New York University, and the IIM Ahmedabad, his love of academics has been overwhelming. He applied academic principles at practical problems and found undisputed solutions. Upon completion of his term as chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, he returned to academics and is now serving and actively contributing as chairman, Madras School of Economics. I have never seen any controversies in what he speaks or writes and rises above all biases. As Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, he led the reforms from the front and was part of the team of those men and women who shared with him the dream of an equitable, just, and inclusive India. He has been a great votary of financial inclusion. It was he who sowed the seeds of financial inclusion with women at the very center, having allowed self-help groups to be recognized as formal entities and open bank accounts as a game changer that economically empowered millions of women in the country and spurred financial inclusion. Growth and inclusion are two sides of the same coin. Dr. Rangarajan acknowledged it well and weaved these together to produce a cohesive pattern of growth that generated additional resources to be utilized to meet the socio-economic goals and facilitate greater inclusion. Computerization of the bank branch operations was a far-reaching reform that was led by Dr. Rangarajan. He had the vision of taking banking at the doorsteps of people and servicing customers at a quicker pace. He has been a pillar of economic community of our country and anchored policies as they evolved.
Mute. Thank you so much, sir, for those very encouraging words. Now I invite Dr. Bibek Debroy, Chairman EAC to the Prime Minister, to share his perspective. Dr. Debroy.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and my best wishes to Dr. Rangarajan. A 90th birthday is a threshold, an event that few can aspire to, notwithstanding increases in life expectancy. So my best wishes to Dr. Rangarajan on this happy occasion. In the last 30 or 35 years, I don't think there can be anyone who has worked on economic policy making in India or has thought about India's economic policies and has not interacted with Dr. Rangarajan personally or read what he has written. This mark of respect is reflected in the large number of people who have willingly agreed to speak today. There are some aspects of Dr. Rangarajan's work, his contribution, that will invariably be talked about. Dr. Manmohan Singh mentioned some of those, and many of these center around his role as the governor of the Reserve Bank in the period immediately following 1991 reforms and thereafter. So I want to quickly mention a few other aspects that others may not talk about. My first encounter with Dr. Rangarajan, not in person, but my first encounter with Dr. Rangarajan was through a very popular macroeconomics textbook that he authored when he used to teach at IIM Ahmedabad. And when I used to teach students in a business school, I found that a very useful textbook. So let us not forget that he also had a stellar academic career and was a fantastic teacher. Let us also not forget that today, if we have a National Statistical Commission, that is based on Dr. Rangarajan's report. And his contribution to the cause of improving the statistical system in India has been phenomenal, and he's also been awarded and recognized for that. Until it was mentioned to me, I had not realized that Dr. Rangarajan was going to be soon 90 years old, because I recall only last week, or not very long ago, that I read an op-ed article in one of the newspapers co-authored by Dr. Rangarajan. So Dr. Rangarajan has also been extremely prolific. Anyone who talks about poverty in India will make some reference not only to the work of Suresh Tendulkar, but also to Dr. Rangarajan's work. Let us also not forget that he used to be the president of the Indian Statistical Institute. Some days ago, I was looking at employment elasticities in India. And again, I surfaced upon a paper. I read it at that time, but I rediscovered it a few years ago. I read a paper by Dr. Rangarajan estimating employment elasticities at that time using NSS data. So I don't think that one should try to straitjacket Dr. Rangarajan and his contributions with a very narrow dimension, be it of growth, or be it of inclusion, or be it of financial inclusion, although in some sense inclusion covers everything, because his interest in a very broad sense has been about growth and inclusion. But his contributions in academia, and a lot of people find it very difficult to transit from academia to working for the government, and his contributions have been phenomenal. And now with the Madras School of Economics, which I'm sure will climb to greater and greater heights. What can one possibly say about Dr. Rangarajan in 5 minutes? So for me individually, this is an occasion to wish him the best, to wish him the very best, and to say these few words in recognition and as a tribute.
Thank you so much, Dr. Devroy. I now call upon Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission, very long time associate of Dr. Rangarajan, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Samir, for including me in this very distinguished group, paying tribute to Dr. C. Rangarajan. I think I want to join everybody, obviously, in congratulating him on his 90th birthday. He has actually given the nation a gift on this birthday by writing a very perceptive article in the Hindu today on our current sort of economic situation. So there are not that many people with as long an involvement in policy who at the age of 90 are actually also writing right now on this very day something which guides policy making. You know, Bibek very rightly asked the question, what can one say about Dr. Rangarajan's achievements in 5 minutes? This becomes more difficult for me when others have already spent their 5 minutes, and I mean, I would only be endorsing what they've already said. But I do want to just draw attention to 3 or 4 things and maybe touch upon, you know, my own personal journey where I found I was able to work with him, support what he was doing, and also find what he was doing a great support for whatever I was involved in. You know, both Dr. Manmohan Singh and Bibek have emphasized the aspect of straddling academics and policy making. And you know, in this straddling, one of the key things about this straddling is that academics is an area where whatever positions you take are the result of careful argument, and they're reached as a result of rigorous argument. Policy making, as I think Dr. Manmohan Singh was very fond of saying, policy making is the art of the possible. So very often academics don't actually fit into policy making because they have an unrealistic assumption that what they're saying is so obviously right, they get frustrated that it doesn't get done. I think Dr. Rangarajan combined the best of both, never sacrificing academic rigor, but being very tolerant of the fact that progress in policy making will be gradual. That's probably true in all countries, but it's especially true in our case, given the kind of democratic political environment that we work in. You know, when I look back, I feel my association with Dr. Rangarajan doesn't go as far back as Dr. Manmohan Singh, but it goes back to 1980s when he was deputy governor and I was in the prime minister's office during Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's prime ministership. And we interacted on many occasions, particularly partly on academic issues. We even jointly authored a paper on exchange rate policy, which was a sort of a first indication that, look, we really think that real effective exchange rates is what needs to be stabilized, which really meant that, you know, if the domestic inflation rate is too high compared to the rest of the world, then the nominal exchange rate should depreciate to offset that. That was academic, but in the practical sense, he was very much a key contact for me, briefing the then Prime Minister on what's going on our balance of payments, which was progressively getting weaker and weaker because of fiscal developments. In the 1990s, when I moved to the finance ministry and the economic reforms that the Narasimha Rao government with Dr. Manmohan Singh leading it unleashed, he was obviously in an absolutely critical position. I have written in my book Backstage his wonderful description of how India's gold reserves were flown out from Mumbai to London. And there's this charming incident which he himself has recounted, where as the armored car that took the gold from the vaults of the Reserve Bank to Santa Cruz was on its way, Dr. Rangarajan was in touch with what was happening by two-way radio. There were no mobiles in those days. And he was told that, I'm afraid the armored car's got a puncture. So this is wonderful account of this hugely valuable vehicle stuck somewhere in Bombay, waiting for the wheel to be repaired, which it was, and that got done. Later on, when we were unveiling the economic reforms, I worked very closely with Dr. Rangarajan because he was, before he became governor of the Reserve Bank, and after, I mean, he was for a little time in the Planning Commission. And in the Planning Commission, I had persuaded Dr. Manmohan Singh that we needed to take a comprehensive view of what the balance of payments strategy is going to be, and we should have a committee under Dr. Rangarajan to make recommendations. And this was a very interesting example because we had all the relevant people were in it. I mean, the member secretary of the committee was Reddy, who later on became governor himself. And one of the recommendations of that committee was that we need to move to a dual exchange rate, which could later on be unified. So it's a very important recommendation, deliberately cast in a gradualist form, which brought in an important structural change. And the important thing is, this was not part of IMF conditionality. This is one of the reforms that had nothing to do with the IMF. And the IMF was actually quite surprised and pleased that we did it. They had not pushed that we should do it. And as a matter of fact, but for the fact that by the time the implementation of the reform had to take place, Dr. Rangarajan has moved as governor of the Reserve Bank of India. But for the fact that he was willing to assure Dr. Manmohan Singh that this particular recommendation was not just an academic recommendation which he had put forward in a committee which he chaired when he was member Planning Commission, but something he really felt could be done. We would not have moved as definitively as we did. And later on, initially the dual exchange rate was 60% free, for free sale and 40% for sale at the fixed exchange rate. And we had to decide When are we going to take it to a full unification? And you know, both in the Reserve Bank and in the finance ministry, the natural instinct of people was that let's do it gradually. So let's go from 60-40 to 80-20. And Dr. Rangarajan and I had discussed this. And he was quite clear that, look, I think we can go to 100 straight away. So that change within 1 year, going from 60-40 to 80-20, I remember as a very interesting example where if you take a bold step after having experimented a bit, the economy is actually able to absorb it. That's exactly what Dr. Manmohan Singh did. By the way, he would not have done it if he didn't have the confidence that he had in Dr. Rangarajan, given their long earlier association. Now, I can go on and on. There were many other things we did together, but I just want to say that my only request while congratulating Dr. Rangarajan on his 90 years is that I wish he would write his memoirs supplementing the more academic and formal treatments that he's given to all this by bringing out the personal incidents that strike him most. So this is the time to get that done, and I think you'll find a huge readership. But let me just conclude because I've probably overstretched my limit. Thank you for including me in this group, and many, many congratulations. And congratulations to the SKOCH Foundation for deciding to organize this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Montag. Now I invite Mr. N.K. Singh, who later, was chairman 15th Finance Commission, and a position that Dr. Rangarajan had held a little earlier. Mr. Singh.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Samir, and thank you for the opportunity to, and with the privilege of associating myself with this function to felicitate Dr. Rangarajan on a very special birthday. I associate myself with everything that Dr. Manmohan Singh has said, that Vivek and Montag have said. And I've also to say that it has been a period of unalloyed affection, enduring friendship. And if ever there was an example of the old adage that you turn not older with years, but newer every day, looking at his prolific writing, including the mention that Vivek has made and Montag has made of the continuing writing at a relentless pace, which certainly is turning younger every day and not older, as the arithmetic of the age would suggest. My association, of course, with Dr. Rangarajan has also been for a long period of time, not as long as Montag's, but certainly when he was deputy governor, I also had the privilege of interacting with him. But this certainly intensified during the 1991 economic crisis in India, while I was in the Ministry of Finance working with Montag and under the leadership of Dr. Manmohan Singh. He was the redoubtable 19th governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And looking at some of the subsequent things which happened, never has there been greater symmetry, as Dr. Manmohan Singh has pointed out, never has been the greater teamwork and symmetry in the views of the North Bloc and the Mint Street, as during the period when Dr. Rangarajan was the head of the Reserve Bank of India. And never has been a more cohesive action between different entities and institutions of government. And then the period when he was heading the Reserve Bank of India. It indeed was one of the important strengths of India, that all institutions, organizations, and ministries were able to speak in one uniform voice. So, of course, this continued when thereafter, when he served as the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister, and his advice was always, as Dr. Manmohan Singh has said, of great value when he was a Prime Minister during that period. I recall with particular affection and Dr. Manmohan Singh is the only one who would perhaps recall this too, that both of us were together in the Rajya Sabha as a member of the Rajya Sabha. And whenever Dr. Rangarajan spoke, he spoke with great conviction. He was, for understandable reasons, heard in the upper house with rapt attention and indeed with acclamation. He chose to speak few times, and the peculiar system of the allocation of time to nominated members of parliament was one enigma that Dr. Rangarajan could never understand, or why couldn't the allotment of time in the upper house be done in a more scientific way. Indeed, I have written about this in my own autobiography and have mentioned, of course, Dr. Rangarajan in multiple ways in that area. But one of the more hilarious instances, and I say this with great admiration, that when we were serving in the Rajya Sabha, he, given his characteristic humility, was never able to come to terms with the informality of the famous Central Hall of Parliament. He was unfamiliar with its overpowering informality. He once asked me, in a jocular spirit, sitting together as we were in the Central Hall, of what was the system for placing an order for tea, coffee, and biscuits or toast in the Central Hall, and was quite amazed to know that the architecture of the Central Hall was its unabashed informality. Of course, he did not stay for too long in the Rajya Sabha and preferred the decisive policy-making role which he was critically playing as the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, a responsibility which he then decided to return to. In reading and writing his books, and as you, Sameer, pointed out that he was the chairman of the 12th Finance Commission, and since I had the privilege of being the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, let me say just two things. He had done in the 12th Finance Commission some which left a lasting legacy. For instance, his approach on the reschedulement of debts and debt consolidation plan of the state governments was fostered by an amalgam of conditionalities and incentives. He was among the earliest in the Finance Commission as chairman to recognize that state governments work on the basis of incentives and based on the basis of conditions. And I think that what he did in terms of the restructuring the entire debt of the state governments was a legacy which he indelibly left behind. And that's a tradition to build on how can one take the states along in important reform measures, like, for instance, to foster for each one of them to adopt their own fiscal responsibility, state-level fiscal responsibility management act, to be in tandem with the central government's fiscal responsibility management act, was an area where he had left behind an indelible contribution. As the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, the commission, and myself personally, counted on his wise counsel and advice on multiple occasions. Indeed, each time when we talked to him, we were enriched by his enormous understanding of complex economic and social policies. So, as one says, old age is like everything else. To make a success of it, you got to start young. And it can truly be said about Dr. Rangarajan that he has a young start every day, as we continue with admiration to read his contributions, his columns, and his writings. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and privilege, Sameer, to share some of my ideas and experiences with Dr. Rangarajan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. N.K. Singh. I now call upon Dr. D. Subbarao, who was formerly Governor RBI, to share his perspective on Dr. Rangarajan.
Thank you very much. Like everyone else, for me, I'm delighted honored and proud to be part of Dr. Rangarajan's 90th birthday celebrations. Many significant policy decisions of the country, which have had a profound impact on the economic history of our nation, have been influenced by Dr. Rangarajan's thinking, either directly or indirectly. He's been a colossus on the Indian economic policy scene for over the last half century. Many of us who don't have a day-to-day job think of ourselves as retired. Not Dr. Rangarajan though. Sitting in his corner office in the Madras School of Economics, he churns out a think piece, practically one every week. Sharp, insightful, and forthright. I'm sure the policy mandates in Delhi and Mumbai are influenced by his thinking, even though they may not appreciate it or even recognize it. We all know that Dr. Rangarajan started his career as a teacher. He left teaching to take up public office, but the teacher in him never left him. I had an occasion to listen to a series of 3 lectures he gave at the ICFA University earlier this year on the evolution of Indian economic policy since the economic reforms. Masterly, comprehensive, incisive. In fact, I've never come across a more masterly scenario presentation of the Indian economic evolution since the reforms. No wonder that generations of people, achievers in their own right, recognize Dr. Rangarajan as a great teacher. Dr. Y.V. Reddy, a former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, explicitly calls him his guru. Many revere him as a teacher in the Eklavya tradition. But I have been fortunate in having a very special student-teacher relationship with him when he was chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and I was the secretary in the early 2000s. We worked very closely together for 3 years. The clout and influence of the EAC depends on the chemistry between the Prime Minister and the chairman of the council. And as we've heard from Dr. Manmohan Singh just now, Dr. Rangarajan and Dr. Manmohan Singh had profound regard for each other. So what does the Economic Advisory Council do? We don't hear much of what it does because it's a silent think tank. It's the Prime Minister's back office. I don't know what the pattern now is, but the pattern that time used to be that the most intractable, complex policy issues that could not be resolved within the government used to be referred to the EAC. We know that there is a long process, a system in the government of processing policy issues in the ministry, committee of secretaries, groups of ministers, cabinet committees, cabinet. But even then, many issues and an impasse. There's no agreement. The standard refrain at that time used to be, okay, let's refer this to Dr. Rangarajan for advice. So we used to get in the Economic Advisory Council policy issues that could not be resolved in the general mill of the government. I can recall some of those very intractable issues. Exim scripts, coal royalty, poverty ratio, implementation of PPP projects, fiscal responsibility, oil sector subsidies. But here's the thing. The solutions, recommendations given by Dr. Rangarajan worked in breaking the impasse, and they found their way into policy. That's been the pervasive influence of Dr. Rangarajan. One incident of that period stuck in my mind. One Sunday morning, I was walking in Lodi Garden when I ran into one Mr. S.R. Shankar. Mr. Shankaran was a senior IAS officer of the AP cadre, 15 years my senior. He's no more, unfortunately, but he was very well respected, very well regarded. And he and Dr. Rangarajan were contemporaries in the Madras Laila College. So Mr. Shankaran asked me, are you still working with Dr. Rangarajan? I said, yes, sir. He said, what are you working on? So I reeled off the long list of things we were working on. He smiled at me and said, you know, Subha, these days a couple of MS students come to revise the syllabus with me. And the advice I give them is this. If in the exam you know the answer to your question, write it. But if you're doubtful about the answer, preface your answer by saying, as the Rangarajan committee said in its report, and then have a stab at the answer. No examiner in the country has the guts to question that. So that's been the pervasive influence of Dr. Rangarajan. The organizers of this event have just given me a very limited amount of time, and it's difficult to pack all of Dr. Rangarajan's achievements, contributions, and accomplishments into that limited time. So I want to focus on three significant contributions of Dr. Rangarajan to Indian economy. The first, as speakers before me have referred to, is his contribution to the reforms in 1990s. Those reforms, as we know, were led by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, Mr. Chidambaram was in the Commerce Ministry. And there was a very able, sincere, committed team of bureaucrats and technocrats in the ministries in the government assisting them. Montek Singh Ahluwalia most prominently. There was Amana Verma, Y.V. Reddy, N.K. Singh, Gajendra Halia, Rakesh Mohan, all of them. In the Reserve Bank of India, there was one person, Dr. Rangarajan, assisted, of course, by a great institution. We know that the 91 reforms were kick-started with the two-step devaluation of the exchange rate. The way it is carried out with military precision, nicknamed hop, skip, and jump, is part of our folklore. I'm not even going to talk about it because you've got to hear it from Dr. Rangarajan to capture the excitement and drama of the event. But that two-step devaluation of the exchange rate is just the first step of a very significant journey of the external sector liberalization of our economy. Dr. Rangarajan, as Mr. Ahluwalia referred to, chaired the high-level committee on balance of payments, which laid out the roadmap. Many significant reforms. The rupee became convertible, fully convertible on the current account. There was a roadmap for capital account convertibility, explicit preference for equity over debt, preference for direct equity over portfolio equity, preference for long-term debt over short-term debt. The transition from FERA to FEMA, the entry of foreign institutional investors into our G-SEC market, were all part of that external sector liberalization, which bears Dr. Rangarajan's imprimatur. Many of you might recall that there were taper tantrums in 2013 when I was governor. The reason the tantrums were not deeper was because of the resilience our external sector had because of the liberalization piloted by Dr. Rangarajan. The second thing I want to talk about or highlight is the impact Dr. Rangarajan had on the evolution of monetary policy in India, in particular, freeing monetary policy from fiscal dominance. Today, the autonomy of the Reserve Bank of India is a hot button issue. But Dr. Rangarajan started talking about it when it is not fashionable to do so, when it is not an exciting subject, when it is not a dramatic subject. In fact, the evolution of monetary policy in India starts with the Sukumar Chakravarti report of the early 1980s. And Professor Chakravarti acknowledges in the preface to that report the enormous intellectual contribution Dr. Rangarajan made to shape that report. And as governor, Dr. Rangarajan took that forward. His Kutty Memorial Lecture in Kolkata in 1993 must go down as a landmark event in enunciating the intellectual rationale for the autonomy of the Reserve Bank of India, which resulted in many significant reforms, most importantly, most famously, in ending the egregious practice of automatic demonetization. Many will remember that 2 years ago, when the pandemic was at its most intense and the government was struggling with fiscal challenges, there was a talk of whether the Reserve Bank of India must monetize the government's deficit. And many, including I, wrote that that's a forbidden fruit, should not be touched. And that's because of the sensitivity Dr. Rangarajan gave to the autonomy of the Reserve Bank of India and to monetary policy. So what he did there was, number one, freed monetary policy from fiscal dominance, laid the foundations for money markets in India, and gave a sense of fiscal responsibility. That allows me to segue into the third significant impact that I want to talk about, which is the sensitivity he gave to the importance of fiscal responsibility. As governor of RBI, as chairman of the Finance Commission, as chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and even today as a freelance thinker and writer. If, as in monetary policy, in pursuit of money supply as a key variable, Dr. Rangarajan is a Friedman acolyte, in fiscal policy, he is a very measured Keynesian. He believes that there must be fiscal responsibility, but with sufficient flexibility for government to meet any emergencies. 15 years ago, Dr. Rangarajan and I co-authored a joint op-ed piece. It is titled The Importance of Being Earnest About Fiscal Responsibility. In the 15 years since, I've had occasion to rehash, update that, and republish it at least twice, which shows the resilience of the fundamental principles enunciated in the first place. Again, as Mr. N.K. Singh said, the 12th Finance Commission report under the chairmanship of Dr. Rangarajan lays the basic framework for debt sustainability and indicates how much debt is too much and why loading on debt, too much debt is bad. I can go on and on, but I want to stop here because I have limited time. But I want to say this in conclusion, that when the economic history of modern India, when it's written, indeed it's being written, Dr. Rangarajan will go down as a person who served the country with enormous dignity and distinction. I wish him long life, health, happiness, and many, many years of creative thinking and writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao. I invite now Dr. Dipali Pant Joshi, Distinguished Fellow, SKOCH Development Foundation, as well as former Deputy Executive Director, RBI.
Thank you very much. Felicitations to Dr. Rangarajan on his 90th birthday. As we celebrate the life of Dr. Rangarajan, it is with utmost humility that I am here to pay tribute and homage to a colossus of our time, the only rock star economist India has ever had. And for me, I would like to say that Dr. Manmohan Singh and Dr. Rangarajan, besides being father figures, are like gods. They are not human beings. Dr. Rangarajan is one person whose fan following cuts across classes, political parties, one who is universally revered. And Dr. Rangarajan is my guru. It seems just yesterday that we were celebrating his 80th birthday, and his wife, Mrs. Haripriya, was by my side, and today I pay homage to her too. And it is no exaggeration to say that in the last 36 decades of my career in the RBI, there is no policy that has not the stamp of Dr. Rangarajan. He has always been very kind. He was kind enough and gracious enough to write the foreword to my first book. Dr. Montek Singh wanted some personal anecdotes. Well, the first time I heard of Dr. Rangarajan, he had joined as deputy governor. I was 4 months into my job. I couldn't locate a book, and my then boss told me that I've given it to Dr. Rangarajan. He wanted something to read on flight. And the book was, can you guess, The Adventures of Bertie Wooster. And that was the moment when I was entranced by Dr. Rangarajan, an entrancement which continues today. People have been speaking about his contributions to sustainable development. In the field of rural credit, his contribution is immense. Today, microfinance is a byword, a huge and growing opportunity. It is Dr. Rangarajan who first introduced the SHG Bank linkage program. He formulated the agricultural vision for accelerating agricultural growth to address the employment problem. The approach we should take on agricultural trade policy, managing center-state relations, implementing institutional reforms. Till Dr. Rangarajan came along, the monetary policy was like a damsel in distress, and he was the white knight who freed monetary policy from fiscal dominance. He is well known as the philosopher king. The major policy changes introduced during the tumultuous phase of the reforms pioneered by Dr. Singh. He steered the reforms. He steered liberalization. He has been, for RBI, the quintessential central banker. He is a monetarist who batted consistently for central bank autonomy. And he freed the monetary policy from the automatic monetization of government debt. He changed the horrendous FERA to FEMA. He unified the exchange rate with far-reaching economic reform. Dr. Rangarajan reacted swiftly to the Gulf crisis in 1990 when he was a deputy governor. And the initial burst of policy reform in 1992 set off a period of accelerated growth with macroeconomic stability, the fruits of which we enjoy today. A comprehensive set of measures to strengthen and improve the competitive efficiency of the financial system. Dr. Rangarajan dismantled the administered interest rate structure. He reduced prescriptions in the form of SLR and CRR. He freed the banks. He introduced prudential reforms, a health code system for early recognition of NPAs. He recapitalized the PSBs. He introduced competition through the introduction of new banks. His vision has been phenomenal and spans the entire period of economic progress, and it is those fruits that we reap today. He inducted the private sector. He revamped the system of regulation and supervision. He merged deposit insurance and credit. He created a banking system that is more safe, more sound, more secure. He helmed the financial sector. Every innovation bears his stamp. The financial sector plays a crucial role in any economy. He changed financial institutions, introduced new instruments, new markets. Few people have spoken of the currency note press. It was Dr. Rangarajan who introduced the Bharatiya Reserve Bank Note Mudran Press Limited, because he recognized that there is a need for the RBI to bridge the gap between supply and demand. He also began electronic fund transfers, which is the basis of the payment system today. He set up the Board of Financial Superintendent and Advisory Council. In the notes which all of us have, it was Dr. Rangarajan who introduced the special security features in the rupees 10 and the rupees 100 note. He introduced the special thread because he said that with reprographic techniques coming in, the number of forgeries can increase exponentially. Must have this windowed security thread alternating with the words Bharat in Hindi and RBI on the other side. And the picture of the Ashoka pillar was removed, and he introduced the picture of Mahatma Gandhi, and at the back, the magnificent Kanchenjunga. Now, all of you have those notes. He introduced the banking ombudsman scheme. So great was the sensitivity to the customer that he wanted that the customer should also be enriched. He introduced the Rural Infrastructure Development Fund with a corpus of 2,000 crore. And what Dr. Rangarajan did for the personnel of the RBI. When Dr. Rangarajan came, industrial relations were very bad. The computers which were set up had to be set up in the bark. It was Dr. Rangarajan who broke the strike. It was Dr. Rangarajan who allowed automatic ledger posting machines to be introduced. His committee on computerization in the banking industry led to the settlement operations.
We are now quite, I'm sure it is not possible.
Let me just give you 2 more minutes. No, let me give you just two more seconds to tell you that it is Dr. Rangarajan that I owe my pension, as do all other pensioners in the RBI. And let me just close by saying, I will close with a Sanskrit shloka. The shloka says, Vidvatvam cha nripatvancho nevatulyam kadachanam. Swadeshe pujyase raja vidwan sarvasva pujyase. And it simply means that do not ever fall into the trap of comparing the king and the wise man, because the wise man is revered everywhere while the king is revered only within the bounds of his own kingdom. Dr. Rangarajan, I bow in homage to you, and I wish you many, many years, and I wish that we celebrate your 100th birthday with a fellowship of your writing between 90 and 100 years. With that, I close. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipali ji. That was a very invigorating speech, I must say. Now I invite Professor Errol D'Souza, Director, IIM Ahmedabad, to share his perspective. As we all know, Dr. Rangarajan was teaching at IIM Ahmedabad.
Thank you, Samir. Salutations, Dr. Rangarajan, from your institute, which actually, gained so much from Dr. Rangarajan. Dr. Rangarajan did his thesis, if I recollect, on the variability of demand deposits at the University of Pennsylvania. And then he came back to India and was for some time at ISI Delhi. And at that time, the 1966 devaluation took place. And three people wrote on the 1966 devaluation articles which are still sort of referenced today. One was T.N. Srinivasan, the other was Minal Datta Chowdhury, and the third was Dr. Rangarajan. Okay. So in a day today where we are still thinking of external sector issues, Dr. Rangarajan straddles from the 1966 devaluation right till the current times. Okay. He went back to teach at New York University, and there our former director Ravi Mathai met up with him and persuaded him to come to IIM Ahmedabad. That would have been, I think, around 1968. It was definitely a change moment for IIM Ahmedabad. Before 1968, the faculty who were at the institute had all been trained at the Harvard Business School in the case method of teaching. And a new number of faculty who joined from 1968 onwards came from different institutions and had not been exposed to the HBS method. And Dr. Rangarajan was the star of that generation. He actually gave a big flip to the lecture method back again at IIM Ahmedabad. And there was always this constant debate about what is the good way of teaching at the institution. No guesses as to who won. Dr. Rangarajan, year after year, was always awarded the Best Teacher Award at the institute. He then went on to become the first chair of our doctoral program. He actually drafted the regulations of the program, which became the famous Fellow Program in Management, and became also the first Dean Planning of the institute, which introduced a method for faculty to plan their activities, their academic activities, and not just care about only the teaching part of the institution. So a lot of the things that were in place at IIM Ahmedabad today actually are owed to the great work that Dr. Rangarajan did, not just as an academic, but also as an administrator at the institution. He, of course, taught the famous macroeconomics course. And when I was hired at the institute, I was told that you have to fit into pretty large shoes because you got to teach that course. Okay? And of course, there was this famous textbook that has been mentioned earlier by Vivek Debroy. Okay? But he also taught other courses. I mean, there was a course on econometrics that he introduced and a course on economic analysis for business planning. Most interestingly, he wrote, along with Dr. Samuel Paul, a very interesting book called Short-Term Economic Forecasting. And for the first time in India, they developed leading indicators as to how do you forecast corporate investment. That book became the foundations for the Reserve Bank of India doing studies year on year on corporate investments in the country. And if I recollect, that every September bulletin of the RBI was basically on this type of activity, and it owed all its inputs and the framework and the methodology that it used to the book that Dr. Rangarajan and Samuel Paul introduced. In 1977, the RBI introduced a chair at the institute, and of course, Dr. Rangarajan was given that chair. Whilst at IMA, he was involved on the boards of a number of institutions, including the First National City Bank. He was on the Export Credit and Guarantee Corporation. In fact, just the other day, I was thinking of him because at that time, he was also on the investment committee of LIC. And I was wondering if he would be in LIC today, what he would say on the IPO that is due. In 1981, he got a phone call from none other than Dr. I.G. Patel, just asking him out of the blue whether he would like to be the deputy governor of the RBI. Okay. And then interestingly, as happens in India, he heard nothing. Okay. And months passed and he sort of forgot about it. Okay. In fact, as the folklore at the Institute goes, he planned a trip to teach at Boston University. And one day when he was in class, suddenly the news broke out that he had actually been made the deputy governor, which was a shock even to him, okay, because he had not been told before. He got to know of it from the news. Okay. So interesting times. He then left the institute, and then you'll have heard from people before me as to all the things that he did. At IIM Ahmedabad, we will always have a great regard for Dr. Rangarajan for having introduced our doctoral program, for having strengthened the values of academics at the institution, for having, being very foresighted in the way in which he ran the process of planning for faculty and planning their careers in the future, and for the teaching that he did, which students continuously recall. I mean, whenever I go across the world to give talks, wherever I meet former students, one of the first questions they ask is, about Dr. Rangarajan and some of the stalwarts of his time, including Professor Mote. So it's very interesting. Many people remember him for the work that he did after he left the institution. I think when he was at the institute, 1968 till about 1982, the generations of students that he taught, we calculate that between 68 and 82, somewhere close to 800 CEOs came out of IIM Ahmedabad. And those 800 CEOs would possibly have had a multiply effect in terms of creating a few million jobs. Okay? So the employment elasticity of Dr. Rangarajan's lectures would be far greater than anything else that you could calculate on an economic basis. So Dr. Rangarajan, kudos. Wish you, many, many more years of writing on the Indian economy. We always look forward to the work that you do. And IIM Ahmedabad is, always proud of the association it has had with you. And we wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor D'Souza, and thank you very much for having IIM Ahmedabad co-organize this session with us. Grateful to your support. Now I invite Rima Nanavati ji, Executive Director, Seva. Rima Ben, you are on mute, I think.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Yes. Yeah. Namaste. It is indeed my honor and privilege to be on this distinguished group. And also congratulations to SKOCH Foundation on organizing this session. And I feel honored to have the opportunity to share Dr. Rangarajan's immense contribution. I'll be speaking very different from what the previous speakers, all the policy makers have said, but this is to the informal sector of our country, not just India, but also globally, in asset building, which is one of the surest ways to fight poverty. We at Seva know Dr. Rangarajan, therefore, as our dear brother of women bankers. And I speak here on behalf of the 2.1 million members of Seva, all women workers of the informal economy. And when in 1974, our members demanded easy and affordable access to finance, we set up our own bank, Seva Bank. And that's how it is today, an urban cooperative bank. And we do remember that Dr. Rangarajan, who always believed in financial inclusion of the poor, visited Seva and Seva Bank on several occasions. He was deeply keen and interested to learn how poor and women run a bank, how financial inclusion actually happens. Dr. Rangarajan will sit in the meetings and listen to the experience rather than he giving a speech. This showed Dr. Rangarajan's passion and his support to Seva's quest for economic growth of income and assets at the household level under women, poor and working women's leadership in thousands each year for now over 5 decades. This includes savings, credits, insurance, pension, and latest after the pandemic is the Livelihood Recovery and Resilience Fund. We at SEWA and personally are very grateful for his support to SEWA's efforts to put financial services at the service of the poor working women. As the previous speaker had said, it was Dr. Rangarajan who brought out the circular for linking self-help groups with the nationalized banks. And the first step, which is in formalizing the informal sector or in actually making financial inclusion of the women. Opening self-help group accounts alone does not help fight poverty and serve the credit needs of SHGs. And it was again Dr. Rangarajan who also brought lending by the banks, public sector banks to SHGs. This not only accelerated the SHG movement in India, but also globally. So on behalf of SEWA and personally, and also our founder, Mrs. Ela Bhatt, who's also my mother-in-law, we convey our gratitude and wish you all the very best for many more years to come, Dr. Rangarajan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ela Ben. I now invite Professor Mahendra Dev, Director and Vice Chancellor of IGIDR, a long-standing friend of Dr. Rangarajan. Professor Dev.
Thank you, SKOCH Foundation, for inviting me. Congratulations to Dr. Rangarajan for completing 90 years. His contributions to the country on teaching, research, and as policy maker are well known. Like his research and policy making, his teaching is equally appreciated in the profession. I will briefly talk about my 5 minutes, my association and joint work with Dr. Rangarajan. So on my association with him, when he was at RBI, I was in IGIDR in Mumbai. As Deputy Governor and Governor of RBI for a decade, during 1987 to 1997, he helped strengthening the activities of IGIDR. In the 1990s, like many others, we were all excited about the economic reforms, in the country at IGIDR. Dr. Rangarajan was part of the economic reforms process as Governor of the RBI. He also initiated, of course, as mentioned earlier, far-reaching reforms in exchange rate, India's financial sector to make banks competitive and efficient. So his speeches, articles on reforms, growth, monetary policy, exchange rate, financial sector, and inflation as Governor of RBI were very useful to our research on economic reforms at the institute in IGIDR. Later, he was Governor of Andhra Pradesh. I was Director of SES in Hyderabad. He used to give wonderful lectures on various topics on Indian economy in Hyderabad and different parts of the combined Andhra Pradesh. People in the state were looking forward to governor's speeches, which is rare in any other state as head of the state. Later, he became chairman of the 12th Finance Commission. As earlier speakers mentioned, the report of the 12th Finance Commission was regarded as being path-breaking in furthering fiscal decentralization in India and for laying the foundation for fiscal consolidation. As you know, Dr. Rangarajan has chaired a number of high-level committees. I will mention one committee on data, which Bibek Debroy mentioned earlier. The report of the National Statistical Commission. This report gave more than 600 recommendations on various sectors of the Indian economy. When I was at the National Statistical Commission, later we were using this quite frequently. Data quality has improved a lot because of implementation of the recommendation of the report. So I am privileged to be a member of the two committees chaired by Dr. Rangarajan. One is the Committee on Financial Inclusion. As Dr. Manmohan Singh and others mentioned, this led to financial inclusion across the country, including women's self-help groups. The other one is expert group on poverty measurement. He worked hard to produce a quality report on poverty. When I was in the government as chairman of CSCP in the Ministry of Agriculture, he was the chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. So I used to interact with him and discuss on agriculture prices. In fact, his report on sugarcane pricing is very useful to the Ministry of Agriculture and others. In the last few years, Dr. Rangarajan and myself have been writing on poverty measurement, trends and policies. So we emphasize that while it's important to know how policies operate at grassroots level, we must not overlook the relevance of macroeconomic policies in reducing poverty. For example, growth period, high growth period during 2004 to 2011-12, the number of poor came down by 137 billion. Even global multidimensional poverty showed that the number of poor came down by 271 million. Of course, second one, we advocated safety nets apart from growth. Also, there are so many multidimensional indices which are coming up to measure poverty and well-being. We have argued that consumption-based poverty is still relevant. However, there are some issues with consumption data, particularly the difference between national accounts and NSS data on consumption. On economic growth, his recent articles are worth reading. He wrote today in Hindu a very good article on growth. In general, he is very optimistic about India's growth prospects in future with right policies. To conclude, his contributions as a teacher to the academic institutions, policymaker, and chairman of several committees and data quality are invaluable. His policy suggestions on economic growth, financial sector, inclusive growth, poverty, etc., have been extremely useful to the country. So with this, I wish Dr. Rangarajan a good health and many more years of productive work, including continuation of our joint work on growth and poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahendra Dev. I now invite Professor Abhiman Das, Chairperson, Misra Center for Financial Markets and Economy, IIM Ahmedabad, and he's been supporting us in making this event happen. Professor Das.
Good evening. On behalf of the Misra Center for Financial Markets and Economy, IIMA, and on my personal behalf, it is an absolute privilege and honor to be here. Dr. Rangarajan is an institution in himself. Distinguished, I think very distinguished panelists have spoken at length about his contribution to India's growth and development during last 6 decades, both as academician, thinker, policymaker, as well as an administrator. At the age of 90, he is still equally active, particularly in public discourse on macroeconomic policy issues. Many have already highlighted that even today, he has written on a topic which of immediate relevance now. I moved from the Reserve Bank to IIMA in 2015. He was our governor when I joined the Reserve Bank of India in 1994. As we know, once governor, he always remained governor for us. I have been meeting him quite regularly during last 3-4 years, particularly before COVID, while he was at the Ahmedabad University, which is adjacent to IIMA. Some of my interaction even during that time was very fascinating. Even he used to ask me some econometric questions, how to model some particular features of exchange rate, and we had several such discussions. And during that time, I was also holding the chairperson of the PhD program of IIMA. And I happen to know that it was introduced by none other than Dr. Rangarajan, what Professor Everidis just said. So I thought I will, at least talk to him and get his guidance before I take over as the chair of the PhD program. I still remember how lucidly he introduced or he explained the meaning of knowledge dissemination to knowledge creation, what has been the basis of IIMA's PhD program as of today. So let me touch upon a few of his long-standing contributions which have not been talked so far here today. The first point I just want to highlight his contribution to national statistical system. I think some of these have been told, but I would like to highlight maybe a couple of things in particular. Let me talk his contribution of introducing countrywide CPI. You know, the idea of India not having CPI or having a CPI, the process was on for a long period of time. And I happen to work very closely for the National Statistical System, National Statistical Commission, even to draft some of the chapters. So as part of this report, chaired by Dr. Rangarajan, the report suggested introduction of CPI for urban, CPI for rural, state CPI, which became reality in 2012. And we know unless a CPI was not even there, we could not even thought about inflation targeting as of today. You can see from where it started and from which direction this has led to in monetary policy today. The same report also spoke about few other service sector price indices. A lot of work has been done, but somehow that work has been stalled. We know how difficult it has been to deflate GDP from nominal to real in absence of appropriate price deflator. And in that direction, these indices would be very useful. Hope at some point in time those would be available for us. The third point I just wanted to mention is the availability of MCA data, which has changed the facet of the GDP computations of today. The idea of using administrative data in statistics, in national statistics, actually was originated in a big way in the National Statistical Commission report. And he also emphasized in the report the problems of using administrative data, which possibly, we did not pay adequate attention to, and we had several issues using MCA data down the line. He also spoke about a lot on unorganized sectors in GDP. Still, these things have not been implemented. I hope these things are, paid attention to, and a lot of things what has been said in this particular committee report. It's 73 pages of recommendation which was made to make Indian statistical system much stronger. It has helped in many ways to get data and data quality, but I think a lot can be done if we look back what it was said in his report. The third point I just want to highlight, because many of the things have been said, is I think his influence on the committee he was chairing, the committee of disinvestment. The committee submitted its report in 1993, which recommended disinvestments up to 49% to be allowed in companies, reserved for the public sector, and 100% in other entities. We all know the influence of that committee report up to date. Finally, some of this has been said even while he was a member of Sukumar Chakraborty committee report, while he was at the IIMA. Some of the recommendation actually formed the basis of interest rate deregulation. Even it was thought that time. And he was one of the key members of Sukumar Chakraborty committee report. Let me end with maybe a little bit of, on my personal anecdote, my personal association with him. I have had, I think, the good fortune of 2 direct association with Dr. Rangarajan. As a officer at RBI, the day my first note went to Dr. Rangarajan, we as a group celebrated and we had dinner outside. RBI being bureaucratic organization, for a junior officer sending a note and reaching up to governor, it was not that simple. So I still remember that day, but I do not want to highlight this one. The second one I just want to highlight on a lighter vein. As governor RBI, he graced my wedding reception, not because he knew me, a junior officer of RBI, but because my father-in-law was closely working with him in the Reserve Bank. And the last point I just want to highlight, as I also had the good fortune of receiving C.R. Rao National Statistics Award from his hands. I still remember those moments. I have been meeting him quite regularly while he was here. The other point I just want to end with, that he introduced one Golden Jubilee Fellowship or scholarship at RBI, through which Reserve Bank of India is sending 4 to 6 officers every year for higher studies. We can't tell you how much this scheme has benefited the Reserve Bank. I still owe a lot for that scheme. I was one of that scholars. Sir, I wish you very good health And we all look forward to celebrate your 100th birthday soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Das. When we had conferred the SKOCH Challenger Lifetime Achievement Award on Dr. Rangarajan, we had also produced a documentary film on his life called The Philosopher King. It is 20 minutes long film, so we're trying to run an abridged version. And here, the credit for the film goes to Dr. Gursharan Dhanjal, who's our vice chairman, who did the production and editing and the cinematography. So it's basically his baby that we are trying to share a very small snippet out of.
The day he retired, my column appeared, which titled Rangarajan, the Philosopher King.
He's a very strong believer in women's rights, and he's a very strong believer that women must gain financial independence and must become decision makers in the family, in the house, everywhere. And that's an enduring value that he passed on to us.
Fair play to an extreme which could go against him. Fair play to the other person. Compassion for others. Generosity to people. Helping people who hurt him. You know, what I'm saying is, in this kind of dog-eat-dog world, which is the reality outside, this is why I had labeled him and summed it up as the Philosopher King.
This is indeed a deeply touching occasion. I'm indeed very grateful to Samir Kocher, Professor Pathak, and our colleagues for deciding to give me the Lifetime Achievement Award today. I have received many awards earlier, but I must admit this is perhaps the most moving of all the things that I have received.
गोपाल गाते चलो कृष्ण गोविंद गोपाल गाते चलो अपनी मुक्ति का मार्ग बनाते चलो लोग कहते हैं भगवान आते नहीं लोग कहते
That's now I invite Dr. Rangarajan himself to address us all. Sir.
Sir, you are muted. Kindly unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes,
yes sir.
Yeah. Dr. Manmohan Singh, Mr. Samir Kocher and friends. First of all, I'm deeply thankful to all of you for your presence this evening. Once again, I'm deeply grateful for the very kind words you have said of me. It is truly overwhelming. When I look back at my long life, the first part of it was spent in the academia. That may be a little less than half of my adult life. The second half was spent in public policy making. Everything in life is not planned. Some are, and some others are not. As somebody put it, life is very often a matter of circumstance. The first part of my life, going to a good college in India, going for higher education later on, teaching abroad and teaching at home, was a process of gradual planning. But when in 1982, when I moved from the academia to the Reserve Bank, it was not planned. I had not thought about it earlier. I did not work for it. And I would therefore say it is accident. But then that made a change in my career. In fact, in 1990-91, when I left the Reserve Bank of India, I thought I had left it for good. But then I came back to the Reserve Bank of India because of a certain change in circumstances as governor. And I must thank Dr. Manmohan Singh for giving me the opportunity to serve as the head of the central banking institution of the country. When I first moved to the Reserve Bank of India, the question that used to be asked of me very frequently was the transition from the academia to the central banking was difficult? My answer is that it was not. Much of the work that the Reserve Bank of India was doing was also intellectual in character, and therefore the transition didn't make that difficult. But there is one difference between being in academia and in policy making. In academia, the professors write at their own pace, at their own leisure. But in policy making, it is different. You need to bring to bear on the problem before you all the command over the knowledge that you have. And therefore, if you miss that opportunity, then something is lost. Therefore, there is that difference between the way in which academics work and the way in which the policymakers work. Also, there is the responsibility to take the consequences of the action that you take. I recall one incident. When I first came into the Reserve Bank, I got a file which came from the executive director. And I did not agree with him. So like an academic, I called him into my office and told him and explained to him why I don't agree with him and why what he has written needs to be changed, or what's the fault with what he had written. He listened to me, but he's an old diehard in the Reserve Bank of India. And all that he did was to turn to me and said, "Sir, you have the prerogative to overrule me." And that was all the answer that he gave. That essentially means where the buck stops. And that is the way in which the system works. So there is an advantage in being an academic coming into the Reserve Bank of India. But let me also say, mine was the first appointment ever made in the Reserve Bank of India at that time, from academia to the deputy governorship. All others had come either from within or from the government, except, of course, R.K. Hazari, who came from being editor of the Economic and Political Weekly. The 1980s, that is when I began working in the Reserve Bank of India, was marked by fiscal dominance. In fact, monetary policy had, in a sense, was tied so closely to what was happening in the fiscal area. And therefore, there was a war of words between the Reserve Bank of India and the government. We wrote periodically letters telling the government how to contain the fiscal deficit. But while this is true, and while the government also recognized it, but there were many changes that happened in the Reserve Bank of India at that time, to which I wish to recall. A mention was made about the Chakravarti Committee report. I had a big part in writing that report. It was Dr. Manmohan Singh who really felt the need for such a committee and and constituted that committee. But of course, he was not there. But by the time the committee gave its report, the most important point in the committee's report was not only suggesting a flexible monetary target, but also emphasizing the fact of the close relationship that exists between the government and the Reserve Bank. The tangency point is very much on the level of borrowing and the support that the central bank will be forced to give if the level of borrowing is very high. Consequent upon the Chakravarti Committee report, we really did a lot in terms of widening the money market, introducing new institutions, and so on. I must refer to one experiment in April 1985, which we introduced. And that was to give freedom to the banks to fix the rate of interest on deposits up to 1 year, subject to a maximum of 8%. This, we thought, was an important way to move towards greater freedom. You can see the genesis of the reforms there. But that was an aborted experiment. The banks did not know how to handle it, but that we could have taken care of. But the real problem was the mindset of the government also at that time was not in favor of it. And therefore, we had to withdraw it. Malhotra, who was the governor then, and I spent an agonizing period writing a circular, withdrawing the earlier circular which gave freedom to the banks. Apparently, the time has not come for the new idea to catch up. And I must also refer to the fact that in terms of fixing of the exchange rate, while there was a basket and all that, it was very clear to us, and the lead was also given by Dr. Manmohan Singh when he was governor. And Montague also came, and the three of us essentially put it together in terms of how we manage the exchange rate. As I used to make use of the expression, we tried to mimic the market when we were trying to determine the exchange rate. But in spite of all the war of letters between the Reserve Bank and the government, we ended the 1980s in a very disastrous situation. A big current account deficit, high fiscal deficit, and a serious balance of payments problem. Then in 1990-91, we were negotiating, a reference to which was made by Samir Koch. I was really, when I was sitting in the building of IMF, felt very small. I was wondering, I was always thinking, what has brought us to this particular situation? And that is a kind of thinking which really started to move in the terms of reforms. Because many people ask a question, why is it the same set of people who had earlier supported the control regime changed their mind and attitude after 1990? I think it is the gravity of the problem that we faced in 1990 that told us that business as usual cannot happen. Reference was made to the two-step devaluation and all that. The most important change, if you look at it from the point of view of the reforms, was that we did not adopt the same procedure to deal with the balance of payments problem. This is not the first time that India had faced a balance of payments problem. But previously, what we used to do was tighten the imports even more so that the balance of payment situation will improve. But no, at this time, we made a dramatic change. The external sector management involved moving towards a more liberal trade, reducing the tariffs, removing the import controls. So this, and I must say, add that this by itself would not have done it. By we moved the exchange rate management, to which Montague made a reference, and we also opened up the flow of resources which would finance the current account deficit. So it was a whole set of recommendations in the external sector which made, I think, the external sector management as the most success story of the reforms. Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh led the reform movement. I'm happy to have been part of that particular, or the team, which essentially put through this program. L.K. Singh mentioned to the fact that there was a total understanding and working together in order to achieve certain goals. Of course, there was a big crisis we had to overcome. When somebody asked me the question, was there not a fight between the governor and the Reserve Bank at that time? My answer at that time used to be that we could not afford the luxury of a fight at that time. The situation was very serious. But nevertheless, I must say, it is not as if that the government and the RBI agreed on everything and so on. What I'm stressing is that we found a medium and we found a way to resolve the issues. RBI, with its mandate for price stability and financial stability, has to take its own views on the matters. But there should always be a mechanism so that the difficulties are resolved. I will not extend the story very long. I believe that the structure of the central bank of the country, as Mr. Subbarao pointed out, underwent a big change during this period. The abolition of the ad hoc treasury bill system and moving away from automatic monetization of the fiscal deficit, allowing, asking the government to come to the market and raise borrowing at market determined rates of interest. This is a very key thing. That only after that, both open market operations and bank rate, or the repo rate as we now call it, can become policy rates. Without that, the policy instruments, the Reserve Bank will be without the required policy instruments. And on the banking system, we made number of changes. I think the introduction of the prudential norms did not go without difficulty. I was used to be asked by the trade unions at that time, why are you introducing all the prudential norms? All these banks are owned by the government. Do you think the government will allow the bank to become bankrupt? So why all these prudential norms? I have to tell them that even though they are owned by the banks, each institution must be strong in itself. And that is the only way to run the system. So there were many reforms that were introduced, which I think constituted basis for the continuance of the reforms later. As I said, I was happy to be part of the team which ushered the reforms. But there were very many moments of great strain and stress. Shipping of gold was not that easy. Think of the special aircraft sitting in the airport, carrying 40 tons of gold in it. And just imagine something happening to that aircraft. Something that goes wrong. We would have been in a serious problem. Therefore, periods of stress and strain. But at the same time, there was a feeling of adventure, the feeling of doing what has to be done. Many people ask me the question, did you enjoy being governor of the Reserve Bank of India? And my answer has been, I am enjoying it in retrospect. At that time, it had so many problems. Anyway, I think the reforms did result in a very rapid expansion of economic activity. Between 2003-4 and 2011-12, the Indian economy expanded very fast. Between 2005-6 and 2007-8, the golden period in which the growth rate exceeded 9% per annum. I wish what we had seen for in the next 5 years or 8 years continued beyond that. But the growth rate did fall after 2011-12. And we still have not recovered from the impact of the fall in the growth rate. Part of it is cyclical. As the economy expands and reaches the highest level of expansion, the highest level of potential growth, then it begins to fall. I wish that we had managed the downturn better. There are other reasons which I will not go into. The reform agenda must continue. Almost all governments since 1991 have followed the reforms. Our experiences since 2011-12 also shows reforms do not automatically translate into growth. Since 2011-12, the investment rate of the country has fallen by 5 to 6 percentage points. Reforms are investor friendly, but reforms are only a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for economic growth. We need to nurture the investment climate. And investment climate is a result not only of economic factors, but also non-economic factors such as social cohesion, etc. Therefore, the reform agenda must continue. We must identify the areas in which there is a lack of competition, or the way in which the markets operate, we are not getting the maximum. We need to introduce the reforms in all of those areas. Power sector, financial sector, governance, and even agricultural marketing need reforms. We need to introduce them. Reforms have always attracted criticism. Even the early 1990 reforms were criticized as a sellout to IMF or a sellout to capitalists. Under the shadow of a crisis, we were able to carry on certain reforms. But right now, we need more discussion and consensus building before reforms can be introduced. And timing and sequencing is also important. Labor reforms are better introduced when the economy is in the upswing rather than at a downswing or at a low rate of growth. We all talk about India becoming a $5 trillion economy. We are today at $2.7 trillion. Simple arithmetic will tell you on some assumptions that we need to grow at 5%, 9% per annum for 5 consecutive years in order to achieve that. Growth is the answer to many of our socio-economic problems. And as Mahendra Dev mentioned, it was in the high growth period we were able to introduce social safety nets like Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, extended food security, and able to bring down the poverty ratio at that time. Reforms have to be credible. And for that reason, it has to reach out all sections of the society. In that sense, reforms are not ends in themselves. Equity is equally important. Equity, however, will remain a dream if it is not supported by growth induced by reforms. Reforms, growth, and equity must constitute the triad of policy. They are mutually reinforcing. Growth and equity should not be posed as opposing considerations. They must be weaved together to produce an acceptable pattern of development. Therein lies economic statesmanship. And I'm sure that statesmanship hopefully will be forthcoming. Let me once again thank all of you for coming today and for the kind words that you have spoken of me. And I shall always remember with gratitude what you have said, and I hope I deserve them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rangarajan. Last but not the least, let me invite Dr. Deepak B. Phatak, my friend, philosopher and guide, Director, SKOCH Development Foundation, and the person who actually introduced me to Dr. Rangarajan. And he was the person who had proposed that the Lifetime Achievement Award be conferred on Dr. Rangarajan. So with that, I invite Dr. Phatak.
Thank you, Sameer, and greetings, Dr. Rangarajan. I do not know what to say in this grand gathering of experts in economics. I understand a little bit about financial systems, particularly about the use of technology in implementation, but I understand nothing about economics. But I can tell you one thing, on this SKOCH platform, year after year, I have seen small women's self-help groups coming and presenting with almost tears in their eyes as to how their lives have changed. And I think that is economics. And I think what Dr. Rangarajan did, the nation will never forget that. What is perhaps less known is his penchant for introduction of use of information technology in all aspects of financial systems and banking. I can tell you volumes of things because I had the fortunate privilege of being chosen by him to work on several of those initiatives. I will tell you only one thing. When in IDRBT, we are trying to implement the first network using VSATs to connect all the banks to move money. Today, people will not realize when they use extraordinarily large bandwidths available at absolutely cheap prices, and they do not understand how easily money moves and how affordably money moves. Those were the days when the investment was very huge, and in fact, the cost of operations was also very large. IDRBT was tasked with the setting up of that system and running it, and banks were to be charged for the services rendered. Ramani and I were advising them, and we were wondering because bankers were saying that, look, this cost will be enormous. And I still remember an extremely important policy statement that Dr. Rangarajan made to us. He said, this is a nationally critical system. I do not at all mind if RBI investment is treated as a national investment, as long as the system runs on its own through the contributions. My dear friends, today we are reaping the great advantage and benefits of that kind of decision done at difficult times. As I said, I can go on and on. I will just mention two things here. These are the words of Dr. Montexing Ahluwalia, which I think are most apt. You know, his style, never compromising academic rigor in any of his thought processes and decisions, but fully aware and tolerant of the fact that things in practice move slowly and often imperfectly. In his soft-spoken and persuasive manner, I have seen him nudging people towards corrective action, towards persistent action, and we see all the fruits of all that work, sir. What moves me most is the great passion in your voice and body language that I see today which I used to see in early 90s. I hope to continue that. To conclude, I will only say this. Of late, I have been working for the use of technology in village schools to provide a blended mode of education using both technology and classroom education. And I'm starting with some village schools in Amreli district. And I still remember the favorite bhajan which Mrs. Rangarajan used to sing, Krishna Govinda Gopal Gate Chalo. So I'm trying to sing with them. Now, this is an effort where I want to train about 1 crore teachers and all the children in use of technology for effective education. Is a large task. Anybody who undertakes the large task knows that one needs to have a large number of hands holding your hands to move together. One needs a few hands on your back to sort of push you ahead, but one also needs at least one pair of hands on your head as blessings. There are not many such hands available in the world today, sir, but your pair of hands is one such hand. I'm only 73 years old. I hope to work for 27 more years, plus or minus a few years. And my wish to God is that for each one of those 27 years, I should have your hands as blessing on my head and on the head of SKOCH Group. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phatak. It was very moving. With that, I'm afraid we come to close of this session. We are half an hour behind schedule, but I think even 3 days are not enough for a discussion like this. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. I am Ahmedabad. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
Bye.